what we believe who our God to be in Jesus Christ is the fact that this God entered history, become part of history. And so what happens in history actually matters, right? And with that actually means the fact that who we are in history matters. Like God actually says, hey, you know, like Will, like I know your life history, and there are particular things that you are in pain, like you are in healing of, and God says, I'm going to heal that. God actually interacts with us in time and space, which is really, really interesting. I think often we kind of think about the golden rule and say that's actually what Christianity is about, but that's actually not what the Bible says. So whether it be particular healing, particular things that we're really hurting from, whether it be particular sins. For sins, I put like, academy. I mean, the first picture is like, I guess, the particular healing, you know, kind of like the refugee experience. And I think it's like, I think that's actually talking about Hmong community, I think if I remember correctly. And then, you know, second picture was like, just here's a picture of how sometimes we think of something that's great, like, you know, Asian Americans doing well in academics, but that's a double-edged sword, as you know, right? Because it can be incredibly stressful. And as much as it's actually kind of an uplift, it can be a way in which we kind of think about our salvation. We can think about our worth in a sense. And so that might be a way in which God might want to transform how we think about our education and how we think about social kind of social classism or whatever, right? And then a particular calling, the fact that God might, you know, like one of the things that I think I find amazing in all of, especially the writers and chefs, I think I mentioned this last week, is that like people who made incredible strides and impact in their field as Asian Americans are the people who've actually really connected with their story. Like Viet Nguyen, who's actually teaching at USC, and I've kind of, you know, I've kind of appreciated his work, and you know, he's pretty popular on social media. He shares a lot of stuff on Facebook, and I mean, he's a guy who basically really owns his narrative as a Vietnamese American. He talks about how he's born in Vietnam and made in the US, and how that's really formed how he thinks about himself. And in that sense, he's actually contributed so much to the field of literature as somebody who's actually won the Pulitzer Prize and you know, and is really hugely influential. And I think about, well, what does it mean for Asian Americans to contribute, right, and have their make an impact in the global church? Well, we don't make a contribution by thinking about what we should contribute. Just like how the Black church didn't think about, well, what is our contribution to the world? And they didn't come up with like the Negro spirituals, or they didn't think about like the gospel choir and said, oh, this is going to be a contribution to the world. They were just thinking about where is God in the midst of their experience, right? And that ended up being one of the most influential things that contribute to the world. That's one of the things I often talk to students about, and saying, what does it mean for Asian Americans to kind of know themselves and take their issues and questions seriously? Because like I said, like a lot of Asian Americans, like we don't know our history, and this is not necessarily our fault. This is just how the educational system is in the U.S. and how our culture is. The fact that, I mean, I watched SNL religiously ever since I was like 10, I think. You know, I just love like Saturday Night Live. But I mean, only recently did they even have like a Asian American cast member. It's just, even though New York is very diverse, Asian Americans really aren't like visible. And when they joke around, even with Asian Americans, it just ends up being kind of a marginal thing from the outside. So it's kind of reviewing, I guess, last week in terms of what I was talking about. What I want to do now is kind of just stop a little bit, and I want to kind of ask you as a group, like, why did this topic matter? You know, I mean, all this protest with Black Lives Matters, right? And I will talk a little bit about how it does intersect with all the anti-Asian COVID racism, right? COVID anti-Asian racism, like they're the same thing basically, in expressed in different ways. But what were your questions? I mean, you might have like specific questions about Black Lives Matter, like BML, you know, and I can address those questions as well, whether it be like about Marxism or whatever, right? So I can address those questions. But I just wanted to, before I kind of present some of these things about how do we think about ourselves racially, right? I'm going to focus specifically about the racial dimension of Asian American experience today. Whereas before I talked about just culture and cultural dynamics and everything else. And I did send Chris, I think he shared it to you. I heard he shared it on Facebook, some of the chapters I sent, right, Chris?
Yeah, it's on Facebook, our Facebook page.
Yeah, so you can kind of read up and see how that, you know, there's a chapter on how I think our Asian American identity kind of interact with our view of God, or you know how that can kind of interact. I mean, this chapter was actually written more for younger people, so how we interact with our parents, for example. But I think similar kind of dynamic kind of can function as we are parents too, right? Which is actually a really important aspect of Asian American discipleship, which often I think in a white kind of Christianity, there aren't enough resources that actually theologically that's actually beneficial. But I want to ask you, like, what are your thoughts? And you know, because obviously you're all here trying to kind of hear about how Asian Americans kind of how do we enter the conversation and how we make sense of it with the Black Lives Matters movement and all the protests and racial justice. I just want to kind of ask you. You can kind of you can write in the chat. You can just say, "Hey, I have a comment." And you can kind of just. So what brings you here is basically what I'm asking. What brings you here, and what are you curious about? Like, why was this important for your church? Right? Because we're spending 2 weeks on this thing. And the question is, like, why did your church say this is important? And we need to make sense of this because this is happening in our world. Like, what are the thoughts and questions that came up with that for you? Any thoughts in the chat, or you can kind of just share what you were thinking? Okay, so Daniel said, we stand against injustice and oppression in general, because it's just an important topic. Or what do we say to family members? Yeah, who say, look, like, we did it. Like, we worked hard. Why can't the Black people work hard, right? It's because of the culture. You know, I think one of the stereotypes is the fact that Black people are lazy. They're prone to violence because of culture. So therefore, I don't know what they're talking about. What are they complaining? We need a police force. So why can't we kind of focus on that? You know, if we have police force and everybody followed the laws and nobody would get hurt. I think it was one of the things that people would say, like, police members don't shoot anybody unless they're a danger. I think it's the popular perception, right? So they must be doing something wrong, because that's been my experience, for example. What else? Why is it the recent immigrants think very differently than the people? And actually, the recent immigrants is actually often that way. Not only recent immigrants from Asia, but recent immigrants from like Africa too, right? They might, like, first generation Nigerians might be like, oh, like, what's wrong with these Black people? I mean, that's one of the reasons why there actually is tension between recent immigrants from Africa and like a lot of African Americans. I mean, I don't know if you know, like, that's one of the tensions that came up with Obama as well, right? People thought that Obama was talking down upon the Black community, and some of the African American politicians weren't very happy about that. Yeah, how can we as Asian American Christians stand with Black Lives Matters in both meaningful and sustainable ways? How do we do that, right? That's a great question. Yeah, we're a bit of a third party, you know, right? And it's easy to get lost. These are great questions. Good, good. Well, I think this presentation. So the broader presentation I talked about was last week was talking about the fact that look, even if it's not about race, all this stuff matters to God. And if we didn't think it matters to God, like who we are matters to God. This is a long journey, and you might realize the fact that there's certain parts of your life that really, yeah, needs more attention, and that needs to be transformed deeply, right? That's basically why I give those chapters and saying sometimes the devotionals and the Bible studies and things like that that we use, it doesn't really address where we're hurting ourselves. But it turns out that this is who God is in general. God just cares about history, and God cares about justice. God cares about who we are. Now, given that, right? Because given that, that's the foundation. If this doesn't matter to God, then we're basically imposing kind of a social issue upon God. And people might say, well, this is a political issue, cultural issue. Why does it matter, right? Should the church care about it? And so that foundation of saying the fact that this is who God is, God interacts with us in history, and God sees people who they are, that's really, really important. Without that, it's like, well, I mean, you're basically like, you're just basically having a political fight back and forth, right? And saying, and so a lot of people would say, well, we should leave that outside the church. That should not enter the church because church is spiritual and that's a political issue. And what I'm saying is, I mean, it doesn't matter what issue it is, political, cultural, everything, God cares about it all, right? Because this is who God is, and God reveals who God is in history through the whole Bible in this way. So that's really, really important. So given that, we're going to focus on Asian American racial experience, right? And because it's really important to understand why Asian Americans are, and I'll repeat this, okay? Why Asian Americans are erased from the conversation, and at the same time, blamed. We're erased, we're blamed, and we're trying to find a way to enter back into it, and these are the dynamics. And the question is, how do we do that well without just without thinking that fact that we're like same as the white community, which is we are different, and same as the Black community, which is we're not the same either, right? Where do we fit in? So that's basically what we're going to talk about, and I'll try to break it down for you one step at a time. All right, so it says racialized identity, right? Meaning of Asian American. All right, so so what does Asian American mean? I think it's basically when we start. And I mean, because I mean, like for example, like like I am Korean American, but as you know, I'm also Asian American, and Asia is a big place. Why do we even use the term Asian American? Well, it turns out that when you say Asian American, it's just like an umbrella term, right? I told you I like Legos. Like it's just a random term. Like it just means all of us came from Asia, and we're all basically kind of sharing something, like a panoptic term. And a lot of people use it this way, but that's actually not how the term was developed, right? The term was developed. As a racial category, right? And actually, more specifically, it was actually historically developed as a political and an activist term. What this means is this: before Yuji Ichioka at Berkeley developed this term Asian American, East Asians were just called Orientals. And Orientals had this long history of racism, racist overtone, and also imperial overtone, right? This Oriental, we kind of take over this place. So Asian Americans said, hey, we're not going to be called Orientals anymore. We're going to be called Asian Americans, right? And it was a term that these activists created 50 years ago to say, we want to understand ourselves. Our identity is not just a negative thing, but a positive thing to fight justice. Now these days, people don't think about the political history. They don't actually understand the political and activist history. They just say, well, we're just Asian American. And that's actually part of, I think, the problem. We don't actually know this history, because when you realize what the history is, you're like, oh, it makes sense that they have to develop it and kind of use this in a way to kind of fight injustice. Basically, the idea of racial identity is this. Before, because US has such a long history of kind of defining normal Americans as white, a lot of, Black Americans and later on Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans and Native Americans, they had to kind of figure out, well, look, we're being forced as the other. How do we develop who we are, right? I mean, to some degree, it is reductive, right? It's a stereotype to lump people together, but because this was already being done to them. Like Black Americans, for example, African Americans said, look, we need to kind of figure out what it means to be Black so that you can actually affirm that and way to, find a way to resist all the ways in which we're being oppressed. So, all this stuff, all this ethnic studies, right? And this idea of ethnic identity developed 50 years ago. And it happened right around, in the West Coast, right? There was a movement called Third World Liberation Front. If you actually read any Asian American history stuff, you should, Homer Simpson colors. Yeah, if you read any Asian American history, you should pay attention to what happened 50 years ago during the Third World Liberation Front, right? Because that's basically when Black power was there, and they were trying to figure out what does it mean to be Black. And along with them, that influenced other minorities, like Asian American movement happened around the same time as Black power movement. And they said, what does it mean to be Asian American? We realize we're not white because historically we've been treated terribly, and we realize we're not Black. What does it really mean? So they tried resisting white identity. They were trying to kind of understand the Black identity. They realized, well, it's not the same thing. So they developed this Asian American identity, right? And so I think understanding the history of it is really important. Otherwise, it just seems like, we're just kind of being, I guess the people talk about, well, it's like, identity politics. Like, well, we just want to have this, separate people, and people say, well, this separation itself is racist. Why can't we all be same? And without history, a lot of things can actually be incomprehensible in a sense, right? I mean, even understanding the Black experience without history, it's literally incomprehensible why Black Americans experience life the way that it is. For example, the fact that this is like little simple facts, right? After World War II, for example, GI Bill that helped so many white Americans become rich, right? Because actually, that was actually the government investing in all the World War II vets. The Black people didn't get that, right? So when you think about what happened, and then there was all this red line laws that you can read about those things where in order for you to kind of gain like generational wealth, you have to be able to move out of these kind of ghettos in a sense, but they couldn't. So all this history is, when you erase them, all you have is kind of a cultural explanation, right? Black people by culture must be lazy. Something must be wrong with them because they can't get themselves out. Well, it turns out even the Asian Americans, we have our own history as well, right? And understanding our own history will make a clearer sense of where we fit in, and also how this relates to Black Americans as well. So, I mean, Asian Americans have a long history of experiencing racism. It's the same as racism. It's basically white supremacy or white normativity that's actually interacted with Black people and kind of oppressed them. In the same way, Asian Americans have experienced the exact same thing, right? You might, I don't know if you know what percentage of U.S. is Asian America. Do you know what percent we are of the U.S.? Asian Americans are around like a little less than 6%. People say actually, it ends up being one of the fastest growing minorities, right? Racial minorities, but we're on 6%. And so somebody said, well, why does it even matter? Like, why does it even matter talking about Asian American identity? And I was like, do you know why we're less than 6%? Because like the nation, especially California, because before, this is after Civil War. Being a racist immigration law, and it was the first, racist immigration law against Chinese Americans, right? Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And so U.S. basically said at the time, and California said at the time, we don't want Asians, right? We don't want Chinese. And later on, it spread to Chinese to, everybody else, right? By 1920, it was basically, Chinese exclusion, Asian exclusion, it was basically everybody from Asia. So that's basically one of the reasons why we don't have Asian Americans, as many Asian Americans as Europeans in a sense. And so when you erase the history, someone says, well, we're so small, why does it matter? Well, it was artificially kept small, right? It was artificially suppressed to make sure that U.S. doesn't look like the way that, look more diverse. the fact that, we have during World War II, right? Executive Order 9022, where Japanese Americans are put in concentration camps. And I mean, even back then, so the LA Times article basically said, the quote was, a viper, no matter, what generation, right? So I think the idea was the fact that even if you're like one 32nd, like it has to be like fourth generation. And at the time, it was only like second generation Japanese Americans around anyways. They wanted to make sure in every sense, if there was any drop of the Japanese American blood, that you were going to be put in this concentration camp, right? And FDR called it concentration camp, even though there's a lot of euphemism that says, oh, this is actually relocation camp. And of course, they weren't. It wasn't a death camp. They weren't actually being massacred over there, but they were a place where they pretty much lost all their wealth. And it turned out later on, when the facts came out during World War II, a lot of people weren't really happy with Japanese. A lot of the farmers weren't happy with Japanese Americans because Japanese Americans were terrific farmers in California. So it was a way for white farmers to take all the land, and they did take all the land, right? Japanese Americans lost all their wealth, basically, right? And it turns out that in terms of how, there's a great book called White by Law, where it talks about how the idea of being white American was defined against Asian Americans, right? Against Japanese Americans, saying, oh, you gotta be Caucasian. And then against Indian American, basically said, oh, no, not that kind of Caucasian. Indian American is Caucasian, but not that kind of Caucasian. Like what Caucasian, right? And so there's a history in terms of kind of using Asian Americans in a sense to define and clarify what whiteness is even mean more clearly. So Vincent Chen, right, 1982, where, he's Chinese American, it doesn't really matter. People are upset at the Japanese American, Japanese art industry. They basically murder him. And I think they get fined for like, the two murderers they basically get off scot-free, right? And the judge basically says, well, you can't put good people like this, talking about the murderers, like in jail. These are hardworking people who are Detroit auto workers that were laid off. So, I mean, not that Vincent Chen was a great guy. The point is not that. The fact that why should he randomly be murdered? And then there's actually incredibly, like, no justice whatsoever. And of course, idea of portraying the U.S. as a white nation, right? And erasing all the diversity we've had, right? For example, like I said, whether it be Black history or Asian American history or Native history, it just kind of erases it all together. And this is the education that we get. And so, and even like how we think about, there's an article about how all the Greek and Roman statues, the classical statues are not white. It's the fact that paint all came off, right? Yeah, actually, Chinese Exclusion Act, in the end, I'll talk about it later. It didn't really finally end until the Hart-Celler Act, or the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. That's actually when it finally ended, right? And that's actually when that's why there's like tiny little Asian American, population, and then it jumps after 1965, around 60s, 70s, and 80s. That's basically when it jumps, right? And of course, as racism actually is embedded in educational systems, like colleges, even this logo of Fuller, theological educations. It's all basically all embedded in these things. And a lot of Asian Americans experience racism through microaggressions. If you don't know what they are, they're basically like everyday. I mean, if you kind of like just Google it or whatever, there's actually so much talk about it, right? The research on microaggressions was done by Daryl Su in Columbia University, who's a Chinese American psychologist, who basically is one of the founders of Asian American psychology. And he realized the fact that this everyday racism, right? Not the blatant racism, everyday racism that a lot of people face. I mean, not only Asian Americans, but people of color, is actually, it builds up, right? It becomes toxic. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts in a sense. And so you keep on putting Band-Aid on yourself, but in a sense, it kind of starts impacting you. And it might not be blatantly like painful, because all of us have to kind of navigate this, but it does change how you navigate the world, changes how you see yourself in a sense. And these are all the themes that Asian Americans face. There are actually different ways that other people face Asian American, microaggressions, but this is actually how Asian Americans face racism, where people say, hey, where are you from? And I'm like, New York City. I'm like, no, where are you really from? Like, you might not get in New York City as much, but if you leave, like a little bubble where it's diverse, like the city bubble, like I live in an Asian American bubble. I mean, if I drive 2 hours north, well, in California, I guess not as much. But if you go like to Utah or whatever, you might still face this thing. And so this actually can be a very good, a good kind of discussion in terms of how do we experience racism and what does it look like? And there are actually a lot of research done about how these microaggressions kind of can build up over time and can have almost like traumatic impact on people's lives. So, all right. Now, one of the ways, and so this is actually now getting very close to what we're talking about. So that's actually all Asian America, right? We face racism and this is what it looks like. But the question is, why is Asian American history and Asian Americans not included in any talks about racism? You might have a panel and talking about racism. You might have a book on racism. You might have like a whole course on racism, and often Asian Americans are not included. It's because it's a thing called black and white binary paradigm, right? It's a way of interpreting history. It turns out that Asian Americans have been like experiencing racism and fighting racism. For example, a lot of the lynchings in the West Coast was not done against Black people, but it was actually done against Asian Americans. Like huge Chinese lynchings. One of the biggest lynchings in U.S. history was in LA. We have another one in I think where is it? Nebraska. We have another huge one in Oregon. Where if you look it up, these are like historic lynchings where they killed like 15 people, and we just don't hear about this thing because we have a black and white binary in terms of how we see history. The binary basically does this. It basically because history has to be told in a particular way. So basically it reduces and kind of erases the Asian American and Hispanic and other experiences and kind of just tells the black and white experience and says, this is actually the most important, right? And this is actually something that's actually, there's a lot of academic research on this thing. But when I teach Asian Americans about race, I tell them to learn about microaggressions and the black and white binary. If you don't know that, you literally are flying blind. You have no idea why we're being erased on a regular basis. And it's almost as though your experience doesn't matter. It's not even a thing, right? And we have no history. And so generally what I tell people is that we learn black and white binary paradigm, but we have to navigate it. We can't just erase it altogether because because this is so true. The fact that Blackness, there's a activist who basically said Blackness is the fulcrum of white supremacy. It's like white supremacy kind of like presses down upon Black people to use power, right? And this has historically been true. So, and this continues on. That's one of the reasons why we talk about Black Lives Matters. And it's basically why a lot of people of color still support Black Lives Matters and not to say all lives matter or not all people of color lives matters. There's something unique and exceptional about the Black experience that we want to sit there and say, hey, we don't want to erase that. Like that's still very important. And to some degree, technically speaking, like African Americans are like our racial forefathers, right? Without the MLK, without MLK Jr.'s like Civil Rights Act of 1964, we would not have the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. And they're literally linked together because they knew the immigration laws were racist, right? So they had to fix that because of what happened in the Civil Rights Act. So if MLK didn't do all the work, right, they actually wouldn't be the numbers of population. U.S. would have continued to suppress Asian populations, so a lot of our families wouldn't be able to be here, right? And also, like I said, like the term Asian American and Asian American studies and all that movement 50 years ago developed as Asian Americans learned from the Black community. So there's actually this very close connection historically between the Black community and Asian American community, and Black community oftentimes supporting Asian Americans. For example, when Chinese Exclusion Act happened, Frederick Douglass said, this is a racist act. It should not happen, right? This is back then, late 19th century, right? I mean, Frederick Douglass was supporting Asian Americans, right? But we don't hear about this history. We don't hear about the collaboration between the two. We don't hear about how Asian Americans learned so much from African Americans and how African Americans over and over again supported Asian Americans. Nobody knows this history. So unless you actually go through and find these things. So in some sense, black and white binary is important, but in other sense, it does not work. It becomes very, very problematic, right? And because it basically says Asian Americans, here's white people, the most privileged, here's black people who are the most oppressed, everybody's in the middle. And in some sense, the middle doesn't necessarily mean that we're all gonna do well, right? Because there's this idea of middleman minority where we're stuck in the middle where, like for the LA riots, right? Where Asian Americans were economically well off, but politically, we had nothing. If you know about LA riots, this is what happened, right? So there's all this tension. A lot of Korean immigrants who came, who didn't know the history, kept saying, these black people are stupid. They kept saying all the derogatory things, but they literally had no idea what the history was in terms of why the black people were the way that they were, right? Not only because of what the community is, but there's a long history of oppression. And so what ends up happening when all the Korean businesses go up in flames, the policemen come and they block off Beverly Hills and they just let it burn. And then Korean Americans realize, wait a minute, like we're not white. Like we were deluded about how the world works, right? So there are moments in history where Asian Americans kind of wake up and realize, oh my gosh, we thought we're just gonna be immigrants and then become American, but we realize we're not gonna become immigrants to Americans, white Americans. We're gonna be immigrants and we're racial minorities. And that's basically what Korean Americans learned. We're stuck in the middle. I mean, Ferguson even says, right? So we get kind of stuck in the middle. So in that sense, it's kind of true, but let's go on. It's not really true in terms of this kind of clearly whites are more privileged and the black are more oppressed, because it's not a single axis. There's actually multiple axes in terms of what it looks like. Asian Americans suffer in different ways, right? Like black people don't actually get talked about being foreign, but Asian Americans do. And in our supposed foreignness, we suffer racism very differently. So this is how we think about it. In some sense, Asian Americans are complicit in racism because economically and academically, we are more privileged. And this only happened after World War II. The modern minority is this. Modern minority basically says, when it was developed, right? And it was developed as a Cold War kind of a political strategy by US, when you look at the history of it, right? But they basically said, we need Asians to know that Asians are treated well in the US because communism is spreading all over Asia. So what we want to do is make sure that we should present our Asians well. And so what they said was, look at Asians, because their culture, they do well, unlike the other minorities, right? It was from the very, very beginning, racist idea against black people and saying, look, you're the good minorities, not the bad minorities. Because of your culture, Asians, you're doing well, but because of their culture, they fail, right? Without looking at all the history. And so Asian Americans said, oh, great. Modern minority is a social contract that basically says you can actually succeed economically and academically, but you cannot have political power and cultural power. That's basically what modern minority transaction is. That's basically why we are largely invisible, and it's part of the contract in the fact that we don't disrupt the system. That's why when we kind of accept the modern minority myth, it's a myth because it's actually not that simple, right? Anyways, in this sense, Asian Americans can be, in some sense, more privileged than brown and black communities. And if we do nothing, then we will support the system. We will support the system that oppresses. But it's not that simple because, wait a minute here. What just happened? How did this slide disappear? Give me a second. I was expecting this other slide, but then it's not here, and I'm trying to figure out why. I'm going to get this slide because it's an important slide, and I realize, and you'll see why it's an important slide. You'll be like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. But I don't know why it disappeared. So I'm gonna bring it back. There you go. Good. Aha, okay. That's really bizarre. Okay, good. Okay, now I'm ready. It must have somehow gotten deleted. Okay. Okay, back on track. All right, so black and white binary. And so in some ways, we are privileged and we can be complicit if we do nothing. But in another sense, we also suffer structural racism together. Now you can see why this is important, right? So in some sense, we're over here. In another sense, we're over here. We kind of experience both. And the black and white binary, basically, what it does is it basically erases you from the conversation, right? So that we can't enter in. And so a lot of Asian Americans say, well, you know, we're being complicit. And I'm like, it is true, but you don't understand the fact that we're suffering racism, and our suffering is this erasure. And that's basically why we did the name game in the beginning. Like, we don't actually see ourselves. And we also our history gets erased. For example, the idea that the black and white binary is the fact that we are just passive spectators. We did nothing. We just kind of enjoyed other benefits of black people's work. But that's not true, right? There are all these activists throughout history who sued the government in multiple times and fought for rights, right? These are just some of the activists that none of us know anything about, right? And actually, there are activists, you know, Asian American activist group now, right? They actually fight for justice. And people who know this history, right, they support Black Lives Matter. They realize, wait a minute, like, our history is not just modern minority that we get fed through the media. Like, when you actually recover the history, it's actually a lot more complicated. And we share the same kind of, we're the victims of same kind of like white supremacist structures, right? That exists in the world. Kind of to summarize in a sense, what happens is we are erased from the race discussion, and then we're blamed because you're being complicit. Now, it is true the fact that we are complicit in some sense and suffering in another sense, but because we don't actually have language to describe any of those things, we're just like oblivious in terms of what's happening. That's why people who actually, a lot of Asian Americans are entering the discussion by saying, okay, this is happening to the Black community, we need to support them, which is true. I tell people, okay, I mean, for example, there was actually a protest over in Chicago, and their big thing was, look, break the silence because all of us have been silent. And I tell them, well, I mean, it's true that a lot of Asian American Christians have been silent, but Asian Americans overall have been silent. There's actually like all these activists, especially in the West Coast and other people who are trained into the Asian American studies, they have not been silent. But because their narratives are so erased, you don't even hear the Asian American activists saying anything. And we don't realize the fact that there's such thing as Asian American activists, right? And another thing is that a lot of people say, look, isn't that true the fact that Asian Americans, because of our culture, are just quiet? We don't really protest. I hear this a lot, and I tell people, this is what you call a racist stereotype, because it feels Asian culture, right? People in Asia would not protest, right? Because we share the same cultural heritage, right? But when you look at Asia, people protest. They protest, right? I mean, Korea protested and they kicked out a president. So obviously, and even like Japanese and Chinese, there are people who protest, but the question is, where is that protest? There's a long racist history of kind of representing Asians as passive. And so it turns out that Asians aren't like that in Asia, and Asian Americans are like that, because even during the concentration camp, when Japanese Americans are all put in camps, even within the camps themselves, the Japanese Americans are protesting, right? And of course, some of them were kind of shipped back to Japan. So, and when they shipped them back, they were shipping these Japanese Americans who've never been to Japan, right? Like they've never even seen Japanese people like in Japan. Like, they've never even been to Japan, and they were shipping them back. So anyways, this is basically why when you know history, like pretty much all the Asian American studies people, they all end up becoming activists. They're like, oh my gosh, in order for us just to kind of recover our history and know where we are, that ends up being a kind of an act of activism in a sense. In that sense, I think the first that I always tell people in terms of getting involved with Asian American, racial justice and and Black Lives Matters is know your history, know where you come from, because a lot of Asian Americans are doing it as though they're like white. They're like, well, I'm so privileged, so I'm going to support them, and because I've been complicit, I'm like, well, complicity is definitely true, but that's not the only story, because you literally are not white. Now, your education might have told you the fact that you're white because your education is pretty much white normative, but that's not your history. If you know your history, you realize, oh, yes, in this sense, I am complicit. But in another sense, like I've been suffering through all the structural racism and our people have. That actually gives you a very different perspective on what's happening. And people say, well, look, isn't it time for us to learn from Black people? I'm like, yes, we should definitely learn from the Black leaders. But we also did that 50 years ago, right? And we've developed this whole field called Asian American Studies that a lot of us don't have no idea of. I mean, people get their PhDs, they're professors, there's a whole world called Asian American Studies, right? And so, I mean, it's great to learn from Black people. I mean, Black scholars, I'm like, yeah, but there's actually something that you have to learn from as an Asian American, your own history as well. So I think it's one of the biggest things that I tell people, that if you know where you fit in, if you want to be an ally, you have to first understand where you come in and what your story is. And then you can kind of see how the whole thing fits into the bigger structure of things. It's just that Asian American stuff is it's actually not readily available. I mean, I'm one of the very, very few Asian American theologians, like who actually do Asian American theology per se, right? I mean, because a lot of Asian American professionals doing different things, but a lot of them, they actually don't have connections to Asian American studies. Or they're like, just like they happen to be a New Testament professor who happens to be Asian American. They don't actually do Asian American theology. And so it's just very difficult to kind of get this out there. And I think for a lot of people who are Christian, they just think, hey, does it really matter? Does it really matter the fact that we, talk about our racial and cultural identity? And once again, that's basically what I was talking about the first week. I'm like, actually, it turns out the fact that God sees these things. Now, is it the only thing? Of course not, right? Like, is it, like, am I just Asian American? Of course not. It's a part of who I am, right? It's not all of who I am. I mean, there are other aspects of who I am, but it's actually a significant part of who I am. So we want to acknowledge all the different aspects of who we are. Now, given that, when we start understanding who we are, we can kind of fit into what the picture is. And I think one of the steps is to kind of, I think one of the steps might be also understanding Black Lives Matter movement, because it gets a really bad rep. But there's so much propaganda out there about it being Marxist and everything else. That's a whole other field. I think I can kind of explain as well. Why, in what sense Marxism plays a role. Anyways, so maybe you might be interested in that. So anyways, that's basically what I would say. And then from there on, you can kind of figure out in what sense you get, and we can talk about what sense you can get involved, what are the different aspects of what the activism can look like. And specifics of even how there's a question about why recent immigrants from even Africa, they don't understand, they don't support Black Lives Matter, for example. Some of them don't, or like a lot of our immigrant parents don't. It's because if you understand racialization, then you understand the whole thing. But racialization, first of all, takes a long time to understand, right? It takes, even for like Nigerian immigrants, if you've been here for a while, you realize, oh, I'm not only Nigerian, I'm Black. Because, in Africa, they don't think of themselves as Black. They think of themselves as Nigerian, Kenyan, and all the tribes and all the other identities. Asian Americans coming over, they will not think of themselves as an Asian American. I'm like, what is that? Like, I am Korean American. Like, I'm definitely not Chinese American or Japanese American. But what ends up happening over time in the US is that because US functions through racialized categories, and this is very, very problematic, the idea of reducing people to races, but you can't ignore it because Otherwise, the world becomes incomprehensible. Why is this happening to us? So even though the categories are problematic, we have to figure out how to navigate this thing and at least know how it works. That's one of the reasons why not understanding racial categories and how racialization works is one of the reasons why generations, right? Earlier generations, first generation, or even recent immigrants, why they don't understand what's happening. They don't think that race is a thing, but when in fact it's how US has worked for so long. I mean, race has been, there are only two countries in the world where racial categories matters so much. There's the US and South Africa, where the boundaries are very, very clear, right? And, you know, of course, they had apartheid over there, and we have, you know, whole Civil War and Civil Rights Act and everything else, you know. So that's basically why some of the countries in the world actually have, even though like white supremacy is actually kind of spread around the whole world, there's certain countries actually, those boundaries actually matter more than other places. That's why even Canadians, when they come to the US, they're like, I mean, there's definitely like racism in Canada, but it functions very differently than the US. The US has a particular brand of how this works and how the racial categories are very, very distinct. And it takes a while to kind of understand why it works the way that it does. Now, is race everything? No, of course not. Like, you know, people say, well, isn't just playing the race card in every single thing? I'm like, it doesn't work that way. Race is always there everywhere. It's in the water, right? We talked about the fish kind of water analogy. It's always in the water. It might not be the most salient issue in every situation, but it's always there. You never have a situation where race is not an issue because it's so part of US culture and history. And some people said, well, look, when you have a police member and they have black friends, why does it not work that way, right? They're not racist. I'm like, because racism doesn't work that way, right? I mean, you might know this already, but racism doesn't work that way because racism is so embedded in our society, in our systems, in our educational system, in our media. It's very difficult to kind of get yourself out, even though you might have, you know, black friends or whatever. If you know any research about implicit bias, which is actually a bias that our brain does without us being conscious of it, right? And so all the research basically shows the fact that it's something that happens to the media and education and your brain. It bypasses your volition. Like, you don't want to think one or the other. It doesn't make any difference. You basically get programmed by society to think a particular way. And this is true for smart people. This is true for people who, this is even for, you know, true for black people, right? So like little girls, like, who say, I don't want a black doll because they're ugly, right? All the messages they've got, they've internalized these things. So that's the level that racism is actually functioning in the world. And I mean, to some degree, this is actually just history, because US history is taught in a particular way. We don't realize that, we don't realize like simple truth about what the world looks like and how these, like, you know, racist things kind of function in our society as well as the church. And like, for example, if you read like a book like this, Color of Compromise, right? I mean, it's not an academic book, it's a lay book, but he basically just says, let me show you how many times majority of people in the church were for racism, not against racism. I think we like to tell these stories and say, well, the true gospel will save us from racism, but in fact, majority of Christians throughout history in the US has been supporting racism, and they've been on the racism side, right? Just like I've been researching Nazi Germany, the majority of Christians, I mean, Bible-believing Christians, conservative Christians in Nazi Germany supported Hitler. That's actually how Hitler got promoted, right? That's basically how he was able to have all that power, because the Bible Belt of Germany supported Hitler, as, you know, Nazi party. So it just it's not the case, the fact that if more people just get saved, that racism will go away. It might become worse because we're not thinking about this correctly, and there's a deep-rooted compromise of how theology is done and how we understand the gospel. All right, so that's a lot, but I think it's uncovering history and then realizing, I mean, and also understanding ourselves in a particular way that helps us to kind of enter the discussion correctly. I will stop here, and then what I'll do is kind of just you know, field some questions. Like if you have, you know, questions about what I've shared, or further questions about specific questions about, you know, racial justice or Asian American experience, you can kind of share in the chat, or you can kind of just ask it right here. I'll be happy to kind of address them, try to address them anyways. Like from my wife, I don't think she really understood this whole thing. I mean, she kept saying, why can't you just be like, you know, why can't you just be like King and just be like, just support more of love, you know, and not be angry. And I was like, have you read MLK? Like, he is not who a lot of people think he, I mean, he's really, really radical. And a lot of people didn't support him. A lot of Black churches didn't support him. I mean, we kind of just, I mean, I think he was correct, but it wasn't like he was just kind of this marshmallow, kind of like, oh, it doesn't matter. Like, that's not what he was doing. People have a very deep misconception of MLK because all they know is I Have a Dream speech. But that's actually just tip of the iceberg in terms of how MLK, you know, interacted. Like, even like he was deep friends with like Malcolm X, even though Malcolm X was like radical left in a sense. I mean, he knew the fact that these things are kind of were related together. And so for my wife, it wasn't until she saw the documentary 13, and she said, oh my gosh, like racism has not ended. It just keeps on changing its form. And so that's when she started realizing, like, what is happening? Like, this racism thing is a lot deeper than we realize. It's not something that, you know, it's not just about a couple of Black, you know, a couple of like racist people, racist cops. And that's why a lot of activists, they say it's not about bad apples in the police force. It's literally just all of society, all of education, all of media. And then how that you know, has impacted all of our institutions. And so when we deal with these things, we have to kind of deal with it in a lot more deeper way. Yeah, I mean, so in terms of racial ethnic identity, I mean, there's actually a number of the ones that I think people use for racial, let me see here, racial identity formation models. Yeah, I mean, Gene Kim's right here, the start is actually pretty good, but there's actually another one that Daryl Sue and David Sue has developed. It talks about kind of understanding how we are as Asian Americans, and also how that relates to other people of color as well. And it's the fact that we come to stages, right? The fact that there's stages of kind of understanding. I can send you that one as well. It talks about, if you're interested in terms of, I mean, if you're interested, I can send you the black and white binary document, which is really, really helpful. There's actually a kind of racial formation kind of identity models. There's also, I mean, one of the biggest things that I kind of tell people is that there's an article about white normativity, the fact that normal people are considered white. And that's the most virulent form of racism. It's not white supremacy. They're just saying white people are just normal, right? So in the article, it's called Standard White, it talks about the fact that the racism that we experience is the fact that just Asian Americans are basically just, I mean, white people are just normal, right? So the idea is the fact that the two examples it gives is this. One example is, hey, you know, Black people are so athletic. So they're definitely better than white people, but you know what? They're like beasts, aren't they? Right? That's actually how white normativity, that form of racism kind of goes. It's not as the fact that white people are best at everything. They're the most normal, right? So Asian Americans, oh, you know what? They're so good at mathematics or whatever, but you know what? They're kind of robots, aren't they? It's like this dehumanizing of people by saying normal people are white. So those are the articles I send, and that kind of helps you understand how deep this whole thing goes. And that's why when we talk about racism, it kind of impacts. I mean, obviously, there's specific things that we can do to support Black churches. You know, being in relationship with Black churches, supporting, you know, racial justice organizations, which is something that you can do. You can donate as a church. As a church, you can kind of, you know, do book discussions on, you know, on book like this, like, you know, kind of color compromise or how to be, you know, anti-racist. I think as Asian American churches, I always tell them though, like, you need to understand Asian American history, and then help you to understand like where you are, because even some of these books will erase Asian Americans, and you don't know where you enter the discussion. Right? That's basically why I say learning about black and white binary is really, really helpful. And also, reading an Asian American history book. I mean, watching Asian American right documentary that came out in PBS is incredibly helpful too, because that's one of the, it's the first one that talked about Asian Americans as a category, a PBS special on that. Yeah. School affirmative action. The fact that pretty much every Asian American scholar that I know who study Asian American studies are for affirmative action, right? What ended up happening with affirmative action was that a lot of the recent immigrants who didn't know Asian American history and racial history said racism is gone. We don't really have to even think about race as a category. And so a lot of the white Republican Party actually who basically used them and said, well, we'll fund this thing. We'll fund your fight against affirmative action. And that's why if you do research on it, there's tons of Asian American scholars and Asian American activist groups who are fighting them, who are fighting this group, Chinese Americans, who are basically trying to get rid of affirmative action. And I can talk more about that, but there actually is long history. Like, for example, my friend Janelle Wong over at University of Maryland, she's been doing all this activist work to support affirmative action and get rid of this idea, the fact that Asian Americans overall don't support affirmative action, because the majority of people do. The majority of Asian Americans support affirmative action because it's good for people of color and also good for Asian Americans in the long run as well. Academics is the Asian American pathway to economic success. Yes, but it turns out that Asian Americans have to be you need like multiple degrees to get the same job as like a white person. And this is actually like if you look at statistics, it almost ends up the fact that Asian Americans need like a master's degree or PhD to get like a master's degree job in terms of getting hired. And this is actually like that in a lot of places where Asian Americans have to get more. They have to actually prove themselves to be super, super qualified in order to get the job, right? Because there's still so much entrenched racism against Asian Americans, especially Asian Americans as leaders, right? Can Asian Americans lead? And it turns out that there's actually a lot of bias against Asian Americans. And then in turn, Asian Americans internalize this thing and then say, we can't lead because of our culture. When in fact, there's a cultural dimension, but there's actually a lot of racism against Asian Americans and Asian American way of leading as well. There's actually a book that came out on the bamboo seating. What's it called? It actually came out recently. On Asian Americans Asian American and that's what it's called, right? It's called the bamboo seating. And recently, what was the book? No, it wasn't this one. It came out like Jane Hun wrote a book, but it wasn't that one. I forget what it was. Maybe it was called Bamboo City. I don't know. If I find it, I'll share it with you. It was actually talking about businesses. A lot of the fact that in business, because we think, in business we're all doing well, but I mean, there's a guy in Alphabet or Google. But a lot of people, even in Silicon Valley, Asian Americans, they're kind of stuck. They don't get up to top. They don't get hired to be like CEOs, even though there's so many of us. So it's the fact that there's actually deep entrenched racism that's still there, even in terms of faculty, right? You look at faculty, Asian American faculty, because I'm a faculty member myself, right? When you look at the top senior administration, Asian Americans, there just aren't a lot of Asian Americans. Oh yeah, Marlins, yeah. General manager. Yep, good to see that. But if you look at Marlins general manager, who happens to be this Chinese American woman, I mean, Kim Ann, I mean, she talks about how much she had to fight. Every single stage, she had to fight for these things, right? So there's so much fighting you have to do. And actually, you experience more of that as you get higher. If you're just on the low, like in the very very low stages, like you don't like my niece was an intern over at MSM NBC, right? The news, right? So she was a part of that. She said there are all these like interns. They actually do this program where they have interns on a regular basis, and interns are very, very diverse. But as you get up high, even at a very liberal place like New York City, NBC News Division, it's totally white. And she was like, there was so much racism over there. I mean, like, who was that MSNBC anchor woman? She, Rachel Maddow. She was like, even there, so much racism against Asian Americans, right? She was the only one who didn't want to have, she was the only show where they didn't want to have, who was a presidential cabinet? I mean,
Andrew Yang.
Yeah, Andrew Yang. She didn't have Andrew Yang on there, right? She just didn't want to have him on. There's so much anti-racism even in the liberal media as well. So it's just reality. And she was like, I mean, you know, my niece was like, oh my gosh, this is so real. I see it everywhere. Just how people talk about Asian people is crazy, even in liberal places. So it's all there. It's just a matter of, I mean, I think when you're starting out at the lower, like, you know, level, I guess students, you don't experience it, but as you get higher, it's definitely there. And that's something I realized as well. It's actually a lot more structural dimension. It's not just individual people. And I've seen all this stuff at Fuller as well. Individually, people are nice, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the levels of how this is infiltrated. Like when I was studying over at Princeton Seminary, Sandy Lee used to say, I used to complain like, hey, how come we don't have a lot of Asian American theology books? And he said, you don't know anything, because he was so mad. He's like, the publishers won't publish our books. They won't accept the proposals. And I was like, what? And he's like, you don't know how this works. And actually, even now, I was talking to some of the people, some of the top university presses, they won't accept Asian American books. So Asian American theology books, right? So it's actually very deeply entrenched. And that's basically why when Asian Americans understand racism, they understand the fact that, oh, this is pretty much the same racism, the same structure that the Black community has been experiencing for so long as well. What do you mean here? I have a bunch of stuff, so I'm trying to address it. Okay, so modern minority thing. Hopefully I address it to some degree. Do you think by people stop looking at people as races would help? I have a professor, friend, colleague here, and she's white. She's like, oh, the racial categories are demonic because it was established to oppress, for white supremacy and to oppress non-white people. So why don't we stop using it? And I was like, it turns out that MLK's colorblindness, because he said, you know, during his I Have a Dream speech, look, why do we not look at color at all, right? And treat everybody fairly. That was before 1964 Civil Rights Act. Civil Rights Act that said that, okay, in order to make sure that everybody's treated the same, because MLK was talking about just making sure that everybody's treated equally, right? The Civil Rights Act said, let's actually see what the race is because we have to fix the problem, right? So they were trying to fix the problem when all the structures that were going to help all the Black folks, like they got defunded by all the racists in government, right? And then later on, the neocon movement said, you know what? Seeing race, right, in order to solve the problem is racist. That's basically where the current idea of colorblindness comes from. The fact that even if you see race now, you're the racist for even recognizing it. Now, the problem is history doesn't allow you to do that because it's still there. Now, should we treat people purely based on race? Of course not. That's basically what racism is. But not seeing the historical dimensions of how this is, how it's part of our society. I mean, in some sense, you're basically perpetuating the racism that's already there. So what I tell people is that the colorblindness that MLK is talking about before Civil Rights Act and colorblindness that people are talking about now are two different things. He was talking about the fact that everybody's treated equally, but this was there, Civil Rights Act was there to make sure that we fix the problems. And now people talking about colorblindness now is trying to get rid of this, not this, get rid of this. All the things laws that were put there to fix the problem. And so there are a lot of scholars who say colorblindness actually is a new form of racism now, right? And if you study this stuff, I mean, there are articles on this that basically talks about how colorblindness is actually one of the most dangerous racist, ways. And the people who formed colorblindness were people who are trying to fight, who basically were racist themselves. who wanted to get rid of the ways in which government was trying to address race. That's a really good question. I think I would say, yeah. I mean, colorblindness basically, discounts all systemic racism. It basically is ahistorical. It erases history. But when in fact you erase history, all you have is kind of cultural difference, right? And that's basically why you get the stereotypes like, oh, black people are lazy, they're all violent. This is basically what, because when you erase history, you have no idea where they come from. And so all you have is a snapshot of where they are right now. You don't actually understand like all the things that's been done to people. And it just becomes incomprehensible. And to some degree, even the modern minority, where did it come from? How did it develop? And why are we the way that we are? Right? Because there's actually a lot of poverty within Asian American, right? Among Asian Americans. Even in New York City, there's a lot of people who are very poor among Asian Americans. But the myth basically says all of Asian Americans are pretty well off. And so we don't get social services sometimes, right? So this is the way in which colorblindness and kind of this idea of kind of the myth that we have hurts our community as well. Let me see here. I'll make sure you address this thing. Many Asian American immigrant families I work with, including parents, worked multiple jobs, saved, and bought them. And family out of poverty, a lot of underlying resentments why other minorities are unable to do the same thing, and are, on the other hand, looking for handouts or excuse. I think, once again, if you ignore the history of what that looked like, and the fact that there's actually so much violence, and actually even police violence, right? When you don't believe in the system, it's really hard for you to work. I mean, so we talk about police violence, and the things that are being captured are like outrageous. You're like, how is this possible? How are people just kind of being to be shot? And when you have a comparison between like, here is a white person wielding a knife, waving it around, running after the policeman, and the police are like running away from them. And here's a black person who basically fidgets and they get shot. You're like, how does this work, right? So when you have all that trauma, it's very difficult for the black community to function normally, right? And actually a lot of Asian Americans who came over, I mean, not all of us, but there were actually a lot of us who basically did have more structural, I mean, especially people who came after 1965, there were actually a lot of people who came as a lot more support, a lot more funds even, right? And so I think we forget all the structural dimensions of what it looks like, and also how much all the systemic racism kind of ends up impacting the black community psychologically as well. Generation of trauma upon trauma. Like it actually impacts their bodies in a particular way. So it's very difficult for certain people to get out of it. Now, it turns out that a lot of black people have worked themselves out of poverty, right? But it's also the narrative. Do you hear stories about, black middle class, right? Like the story, the narrative that we hear kind of controls how we think about the community as well. And the fact that we get continual representations of criminality and violence in the black community, and not enough of a normal representation of black community, it distorts our vision as well. And then we say, oh, these are just there for handouts in a sense. That narrative is actually a distorted narrative and ignoring history. And so much of this kind of can get explained by thinking about history. Without history, all the things we're talking about is literally incomprehensible. And then it's part of the myth and the racial myth that's going on, right? The fact that we're all on an equal playing ground and all of us have different culture background, and some people's culture are better than others, when in fact, culturally, it makes no sense. That's one of the reasons why when we look at like Kenyan immigrants, they're like, wait a minute, like African culture is family oriented, work hard, all this different stuff. What's wrong with black people? That's what they say, recent Kenyan immigrants, right? And of course, they don't understand American history and the history of black people, because US has propagated and exported this American myth, one particular narrative of what US is about. That's basically why for the immigrants coming over, they don't realize the fact that Asian Americans are Americans and Africans are Americans, because that history is not what US propagates throughout the whole world. US propagates a kind of a white America as America, right? And when even people in Africa absorb these things, they can't understand why black people are the way that they are, black Americans are the way that they are. So that's part of the background. I think that's, if you here. Okay. I mean, there was actually, I was talking about Dalton's question about, I mean, I think, so there is actually racial structures. There's actually colorism as well, as you know, that's actually a really big thing, even among Asian Americans. Like brown Asian Americans, darker Asian Americans do get treated very differently. And based on your features and economic class, you might experience race very differently. Like richer people in certain socioeconomic class experience life very differently as well. So it's something you want to keep in mind. Anyways, I realized we're running out of time. I think what I wanted to say is this. Because our educational system is so warped, like just overall, the U.S. education is so warped, right? That if we don't understand, I think the first thing is kind of learn history and realize, what is this all about? Why are we even talking about this? Because all the institutions, academic institutions, even how the history was written was with so much racism in it, right? So that's basically one of the things that we have to do. And that's why people are reading all this history, whether it be Christian history, whether it be, like I said, a book about history of racism in the U.S. And then once again, learning our place as Asian Americans. I mean, if you read like something like Erica Lee's, Making of Asian America, there's so many other Asian American books or PBS specials or whatever you can watch. And then you can kind of figure out how this all fits in together. And then we can say, okay, this is how we get involved in terms of activism. And how does it connect with your faith? I mean, there's so many resources. I think the question is, one of the reasons why I try to give people a presentation like this is to say, look, a lot of the presentations about racial justice is going to basically talk about it from a black and white binary. And you're not, even after you read it, you're not going to know how you enter into the whole conversation. What I'm saying is you have to learn Asian American history. And then when you read this stuff, you'll say, oh, this is how we come in. This is how we need to be for racial justice. And also how we have to kind of, at some point, be doing activism for ourselves as well as Asian Americans, because we're not white. We actually don't have that history, right? We actually are experiencing systemic racism as well. I know our time is run out. What I wanted to say was that, I will share these slides with you if you want to, look at them again. And then I will share some articles if you're interested in reading them. They're actually it's no shortcut to learning, because our just overall as Asian Americans, our education system, our educational background is so flawed unless you actually have some Asian American background. So I just tell people there's no shortcut to learning. We just have to read some of this stuff, right? And get up to speed. And also realize the fact that all these things go very deep. It's not like just superficial. The problems go very, very deep. It's not like a contemporary problem, even though we see that. All right, so I've talked a lot, and I try to address some of these questions. I will send you some of the core articles that I assigned, like I said, like standard white, black and white binary, other things, and also article about Asian American microaggressions. And then those things will all complement whatever books that are out there, resources that are out there for the church to get involved, which is, first of all, educate yourself. Second of all, support racial justice organizations that are out there. You can partner with Black churches, or even support them. It's just general, right? Churches that are in the area, and understand the fact that problem is not, like I said, just it's not a personal problem. It's actually a structural problem and a historical problem. Chris, is that good? Is there?
No, that's great. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think we can just end it. I mean, I know people are still having comments on the chat, but we can just close here. And I think, as always, like last week, if people want to stay afterwards, we can chat a little bit more and kind of process a little bit of what we've been learning. And yeah, I just want to say a huge thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel, for taking this time to do that. It's really, I think all of us would say is very helpful. And even me, not just, I think, understanding, but it also hits my own cultural background too. So yeah, it's so great. So just really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I generally tell people, like, thank you. I appreciate it, and thank you, Chris, for inviting me. When I was talking to Chris, I said, you know what? As a white pastor leading an Asian American congregation, and one of the biggest things I tell people is like, because people ask me like, what should they do? And I'm like, look, know yourself well. That's basically why for Chris, he has to know what it means to be white as well as possible, because that helps the congregation, right? Because everybody, all of us have to know ourselves and where we fit in, and then you can figure out how do we fit into the big picture. Just wanted to let you know the fact that I'll send you a bunch of stuff. If you have specific questions, you can email me directly. And if it's a simple question, I can kind of send you stuff, or I can kind of respond to it. If you have, if you want to sit there and have a longer discussion about it, and if I have time, I do kind of a video conference, different people in different places. So if you feel like, hey, there's something I'm doing in my work, and I would love to get your thoughts on it, you can contact me as well. I just want to thank you so much for just having me over. I mean, obviously, it's always a privilege and an honor, and it's kind of a great opportunity to kind of connect with people in different parts of the country to talk about these issues. So I'm glad that I kind of share this, spend this time with you. So thank you so much, Chris, and thank you so much to all of you for spending this time together with me.
And Daniel, if they want to email you, I don't think I published your email anywhere.
You know what? Let me, it'll be on my slide. So I will send you that as well. But if you want to just email me, just, in thoughts or whatever, you can just do that here. Here you go. I do share a lot of what do you call it? Asian American history stuff on my Facebook. If you want to follow me on Facebook, I'm happy to do that. And if you have any questions on things on my Facebook, you can actually ask me as well. Because there's always a reason why I do certain things. And it's always calculated in terms of why I do certain things and why, So even I know that some people are talking about the election, and there's a reason why I basically chose to kind of post certain things about the election as well, knowing history in a particular way. So yeah, feel free to reach out. Obviously, there are a lot of great resources, and I try to kind of connect people to different resources and say, hey, you might want to check out this, you might want to check out that, right?
And your podcast is called the Centering Podcast, right?
If you type in Centering, the Asian American podcast, then you'll Asian American Christian podcast. Right, so we have a couple of seasons of it, and oh yeah, I think like today, like I think yesterday, I was posting about what do you call it, Patsy Mink, the fact that people are actually talking about Kamala Harris, and nobody's writing about Patsy Mink. And I'm like, how is that possible? She's literally the first woman of color, like in Congress. So the fact that we erase her, it's bizarre, right? Well, it's not bizarre. It's actually it's totally understandable. It's just the fact that it's happening is kind of sad. Let me see here. I think this is basically my neck. Yeah, here you go. So yeah, there you go. Yeah. So you can follow me if you have any questions about it. I mean, obviously, I welcome anybody if you have any particular questions about these things. I kind of use Facebook as more of a information dissemination, not necessarily for this deep dialogue or discussion, because it's just not very good for that. But if you want to follow different things that are happening in Asian America and how to make sense of it, is something that might be beneficial for you. Anyways, it's a pleasure to get to know all of you. Or not to see some of your faces, not get to know all of you. I haven't got a chance to do that. I'm supposed to kind of, yeah. Thank you so much. I'll send you a couple articles. You can kind of check them out. And like I said, if you have any questions about those things, you can kind of contact me and let me know. As an Asian American Center, we're here to support churches and here to support Christians. So I'm glad the fact that we can actually have this time.
Great. And then let's close in prayer and lift Dr. Lee up and also just pray God's continued insight through the Holy Spirit. So let's pray. Dear Lord God, this is hard stuff to learn, because we often haven't learned it, and it seems threatening to us at times. But Lord God, we know that this is part of how we engage you, and part of how we understand ourselves is in kind of knowing our history and knowing our past. And Lord, we know that you are a God of history, that you were a God of, you told the Israelites to remember their history over and over again. The ways that you met them, the ways that they did not meet you and they rebelled against you. And so understanding your history is so important, Lord God. And especially, we know that it's so easily to be deceived. Lord, as Dr. Lee was reminding us, that we can be good Bible-believing Christians and still be racist. The gospel, your gospel doesn't always, even our deception be so strong that we just don't see those connections. And so, Lord God, we just ask for your wisdom and insight to open our eyes to see, to our histories, our backgrounds, the way we have been kind of a part of this story, the ways that we have experienced racism, and also the ways that we can stand with other brothers and sisters who are crying out and saying there's something going on, and we can see it too. So, Lord God, we just ask your wisdom and insight. We pray that the ministry of Dr. Lee and the center at Fuller would increase, Lord, that it would be a blessing to the church and a blessing, Lord, to the world as well, Lord. And we just give you all the praise and glory. In your son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. I'll send you a couple of stuff, but if you feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good night. Feel free to stay on if you want to continue chatting. If not, have a good night, everyone. Turn the recording off.